I never imagined that a simple camping trip in the Adirondacks could transform into a descent into horror so profound that it would haunt every quiet moment of my life thereafter. I was always drawn to the mysterious, the unexplained, and when my friends Mia, Eric, and Sasha suggested a weekend getaway in the remote woods near Saranac Lake, New York, I jumped at the chance. The promise of pristine nature combined with eerie local lore provided an irresistible cocktail of adventure and dread. We arrived in New York City on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the sun casts long shadows and the air tastes of impending winter. Our plan was simple: drive up to Adirondack Park, set up camp deep within the woods, and spend a couple of nights immersed in nature and, if the rumors were true, the supernatural. I was both excited and anxious, not because I feared the dark, but because there was an inexplicable thrill in walking the fine line between the known and the unknowable. Mia was the first to speak up during the drive. Her gentle, empathetic nature was evident in the way she described her anticipation. "There's something so healing about nature, Alex," she said softly, eyes fixed on the sprawling forest ahead. "And sometimes it has secrets that speak to our souls." Her words always carried a quiet wisdom, and though I often found her intuition unnerving, I couldn't help but admire her connection to the land. Eric, ever the daredevil, was busy recounting tales of his previous escapades, stories of midnight swims in icy lakes and hikes along treacherous cliffs. His boldness was infectious, even as his enthusiasm occasionally bordered on recklessness. "You won't believe what we'll see out there," he boasted, his tone laced with both excitement and a hint of arrogance. "I'm telling you, the wilderness here isn't just trees and birds. It's alive with stories." Sasha, our resident historian, was equally captivated by the promise of encountering the unknown. With her head buried in local folklore and ancient maps, she had meticulously researched the area. "There are legends about this land, you know," she said, flipping through a battered notebook filled with cryptic notes and sketches. "There are tales of wrongs long unrighted, of spirits that guard what remains of the past. We might just witness something that has been buried in time." By the time we reached our destination, a secluded clearing deep within the Adirondack Park, the sky had turned a dusky purple, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, ancient and knowing. We set up our tents near the edge of a small, quiet lake. The water was unnaturally still, as if it too was holding its breath. I remember feeling a chill not from the autumn air, but from an inexplicable sensation that something was off. The silence around us was profound, the kind of silence that seems to absorb every stray sound, every rustle of leaves. The first night was eerie from the start. We sat around the small campfire, the flames dancing in the cool night air. Mia hummed a soft tune, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the dark forest as if she could sense a presence there. Eric tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even his boisterous laughter seemed subdued, as if the forest itself was listening and disapproving. Sasha sat quietly, scribbling in her notebook, her brows furrowed in concentration. I felt the weight of the night pressing in on us, an almost tangible pressure that made every breath a labor. It was around midnight when I first noticed something unsettling. I had woken up to the sound of leaves rustling, but when I opened my eyes, the darkness outside my tent was impenetrable. I could swear that I saw a figure moving between the trees, a silhouette too tall and too thin, its limbs elongated in a way that defied nature. I nudged Mia awake, whispering, "Did you see that?" But she merely mumbled in her sleep, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the relentless pounding in my ears. The next morning, the remnants of my restless night clung to me. Over breakfast, I recounted my experience to the group. Eric laughed it off, attributing it to sleep-induced hallucinations, while Sasha listened intently, her eyes dark with concern. "There have been reports in local lore of spectral figures in these woods," she murmured. "Some call them guardians. Others say they're cursed remnants of those who suffered here long ago." Mia, however, looked troubled, her gaze distant as if recalling a memory too painful to voice. Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, we set out on a hike the following day. The forest was a labyrinth of twisting paths and dense undergrowth. I kept thinking about the figure I'd seen, every rustle of the leaves igniting my imagination with terror. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon something that made our blood run cold. Strange markings carved deep into the bark of an ancient oak. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet disturbingly deliberate, as if etched by someone, or something, that wanted to send a warning. Mia knelt by the tree, her fingertips gently tracing the patterns, and whispered, "These are like nothing I've ever seen before. They speak of rituals, of sacrifices, The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches forming eerie silhouettes against the sky. There were patches of fog that rolled in unexpectedly, and every now and then I caught a glimpse of what looked like footprints along the muddy trails. Footprints that were not entirely human. Our senses were on high alert. Every creak, every whisper of wind felt laden with intent, as if the land itself was trying to communicate. That night, as darkness swallowed the camp once again, the atmosphere grew heavier than ever before. We gathered around the fire, the flames barely holding back the encroaching gloom. The forest around us was disturbingly still, broken only by the distant sound of what seemed to be children's laughter. It was a sound so out of place, merry and innocent, yet it echoed with an underlying melancholy that sent shivers down my spine. "It's like they're trapped," Mia murmured, her voice barely audible, like their joy is a mask for something far darker. Before we could ponder further, a sudden gust of wind extinguished our fire, plunging us into an almost suffocating darkness. In that pitch-black moment, I swear I heard a voice, not a clear voice, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo from the very ground beneath us. The voices spoke of old wounds and unhealed scars, of the land's ancient sorrow. Panic set in. We scrambled to relight the fire, our hands trembling with fear and adrenaline. When the light finally returned, the clearing seemed changed, as though the very essence of the forest had shifted, welcoming an unseen entity. In the ensuing days, the disturbances grew bolder. We discovered more carvings, this time on rocks near the edge of a narrow trail, and more inexplicable footprints appeared around our campsite, large animalistic prints that bore an uncanny resemblance to both a predator's and something else entirely. One morning, while exploring a nearby glade, Eric insisted on taking a shortcut. I tried to dissuade him, but his overconfidence won out. Not long after he left our sight, we heard his terrified screams echoing through the trees. We rushed to find him near a clearing, cowering before a gaunt, towering figure that seemed to have materialized out of thin air. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin etched with strange tribal markings that pulsated in the moonlight. Its eyes, black and endless, met his with a mix of malevolence and sorrow that froze him in place. Eric's scream was a stark punctuation to our growing realization that we were not alone in these woods. Despite his obvious terror, he managed to stutter out, "It's like it's trying to tell us something." That night, as we huddled in our tents, the forest itself seemed to groan under an unseen burden. I lay awake, recalling Eric's trembling voice, and wondered what ancient grievance could animate such a creature. The answer, I feared, lay buried deep in the history of these lands. The following day, with a mix of dread and determination, we decided to confront the mysterious presence. Sasha had been researching local legends for months and had uncovered accounts of a spirit that was both guardian and avenger, a tortured remnant of a past marred by colonial violence and the desecration of sacred ground. According to her notes, this creature was believed to be born of both sorrow and wrath, a being that straddled the boundary between human and beast, condemned to wander the woods as a reminder of past atrocities. We agreed that instead of fleeing at the first sign of horror, we would try to understand what the creature wanted. Mia, with her deep empathy, felt an inexplicable connection to the land's pain, and she believed that the creature might be a victim of its own tragic history. That evening, we ventured out with nothing but a small lantern and a handful of old folk songs that Sasha had unearthed from local archives. The forest greeted us with a chilling silence, as if every living thing held its breath in anticipation. Our journey led us to a moonlit clearing where the creature had been seen before. The air was thick with mist, and the ground was soft with decaying leaves. As we stepped into the clearing, the creature emerged from the shadows. It stood there, tall and gaunt, its body marked by ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way its eyes flickered with a mixture of anguish and defiance. I took a tentative step forward, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" There was no audible response, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Instead, the creature moved slowly, deliberately, as if beckoning us to follow. It led us to a hill overlooking a desolate area where, hidden beneath the undergrowth, lay an ancient burial mound. The mound was a silent monument to lives long past, a physical reminder of the land's troubled history. As we approached, I noticed that the creature's markings became even more elaborate. as if it were drawing strength from the very soil. Mia knelt beside the mound, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that mirrored the creature's own. "This land is scarred by so much pain," she murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's as if it holds the memories of every injustice, every sacrifice." Eric, who had been uncharacteristically subdued since his encounter, could only nod in agreement. Even he, the ever-daring adventurer, was humbled in the presence of such raw, ancient sorrow. Sasha, clutching her notebook, whispered, "These symbols, they're like a language of mourning, a record of suffering that time has forgotten." I realized then that the creature was not a mere monster, but a living embodiment of the land's torment, a being born from the collective grief of those who had been wronged and forgotten. We spent what felt like hours in that silent communion, each of us grappling with the overwhelming emotions that surged through us. The creature's presence, while terrifying, was also a call to remember and honor the past. It seemed to demand recognition, to force us to confront the darkness that had been buried beneath layers of time and neglect. For a moment, I thought we might truly understand the depths of its sorrow and perhaps offer some solace to its eternal anguish. But as the night deepened, so did the sense of foreboding. The creature's behavior shifted. Its sorrowful gaze turned into one of desperate anger, as if the weight of history was crushing it. The air grew cold, and the trees around us seemed to creak in protest. In that moment, we faced a terrible choice: stand our ground and risk being consumed by the darkness, or flee and leave the haunted legacy of the land undisturbed. I looked at my friends, each of them reflecting the same internal battle. Mia's eyes, filled with empathy and sorrow, pleaded silently with me to help it. Eric's face was pale, his bravado finally yielding to the reality of the situation. Sasha's usually confident demeanor was replaced by an anxious determination to document every moment, even if it meant facing our deepest fears. My own heart pounded with a mixture of dread and the desire to understand, to reconcile the pain of the past with our present. In that charged moment, I made a choice. "We need to listen," I said, my voice firm yet trembling. "I know it's frightening, but maybe this creature is trying to tell us something important. We can't just run and pretend that nothing happened." Mia nodded slowly, her expression resolute, while Eric swallowed hard and muttered, I'm not sure I'm ready for this." Sasha, ever the scholar, quietly added, "If we leave now, we'll never know the truth. This is bigger than us. It's about honoring a history that's been silenced for too long." With our decision made, we approached the creature once more. I found myself stepping forward, my voice soft but clear, reciting the old folk song that Sasha had taught us. The words, ancient and mournful, seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with a strange resonance. The creature's eyes flickered, and for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. It was as if it were acknowledging our attempt to bridge the gap between us, to understand its suffering. In that fragile silence, the creature turned its gaze towards the burial mound. I could almost feel the weight of its memories, the echoes of lives lost and wounds unhealed. It was as if the very land was speaking through its presence, a silent testimony to centuries of pain inflicted by those who had ignored the sacred and desecrated the hallowed grounds. The creature's form began to waver, its features blurring like smoke in the wind, until it seemed to dissolve into the night. Yet its message remained indelibly imprinted on our hearts. The next few hours were a blur of conflicting emotions. We knew we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that defied simple explanation. The creature had not spoken in words, yet its appearance and behavior conveyed a story of injustice and suffering, a narrative of a land betrayed by time and human greed. The realization was both heartbreaking and terrifying. We were standing in a place where the past was not dead but alive, a constant reminder that some wounds never heal. Dawn broke with a reluctant light, and as we packed our belongings, an overwhelming sense of urgency gripped us. The encounter had left us shaken to our core, and we could no longer ignore the feeling that we were trespassing on a sacred space that demanded respect and remembrance. We decided, with heavy hearts, that it was time to leave. As we drove away from the clearing, the Adirondack woods receded into the distance, yet their presence lingered in our minds like a persistent nightmare. In the days that followed, back in the relative safety of civilization, each of us struggled to come to terms with what we had experienced. I found myself haunted by dreams of the gaunt creature and the ancient mound, the sorrow in its eyes a constant reminder of the land's unhealed wounds. Mia became withdrawn, her gentle nature marred by a deep sadness that she could not shake. Eric, once fearless and audacious, was now plagued by bouts of anxiety and regret, his recollections of that night filled with a paralyzing terror that rendered him mute in moments of quiet. Sasha, however, immersed herself in research, determined to piece together the fragmented history of the land that had so profoundly changed us. Her days were spent poring over dusty archives and speaking with local elders, trying to unravel the mystery behind the creature's markings and the ancient symbols that adorned the trees. As weeks turned into months, our camping trip became a dark chapter in our lives, an experience that had irrevocably altered our perceptions of the world. I often wondered if we had been blessed with a glimpse into a hidden truth, or cursed with the burden of carrying the sorrow of the land. The creature's silent testimony haunted me, a reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that the echoes of history can resurface in the most unexpected ways. I began to see shadows in every quiet corner of my day-to-day life, an ever-present reminder that some secrets are too heavy to be forgotten. One particularly cold evening, as I sat alone by a small window in my apartment, I found myself revisiting the memories of that fateful night. The wind outside howled like a chorus of lost souls, and for a moment I could almost hear the soft strains of the folk song we had sung in the clearing. It was then that I realized that the creature had not left us with a mere warning. It had entrusted us with a responsibility to remember, to honor, and to speak out about the tragedies that had been buried beneath the veneer of progress. In its tortured gaze, I had seen not only the anger of an ancient wrong, but also the desperate plea for recognition, for atonement. With this newfound resolve, I reached out to local historians, tribal elders, and even skeptics who had once dismissed the lore of the Adirondacks as mere superstition. I shared our story, the details of the creature's appearance, the ancient symbols, and the overwhelming sense of grief that permeated the land. Slowly, a community of voices emerged, all insisting that the Adirondacks held a history far more complex and sorrowful than anyone had dared to admit. Together, we began to piece together accounts of forgotten rituals, of indigenous communities whose sacred grounds had been violated, and of a legacy of exploitation that had left deep, unhealing scars on the land and its people. In the quiet moments of reflection, I often wondered if our decision to stand our ground and confront the unknown had been the right one. The creature's message was not one of simple terror, but of an intricate tapestry of history and human frailty. It had forced us to acknowledge that the wilderness was not a blank slate waiting to be tamed, but a living, breathing entity, carrying the weight of centuries of sorrow and resilience. The Adirondacks, with their sprawling forests and silent lakes, were a testament to the endurance of nature and memory, a reminder that even in the face of modernity, the past refuses to be silenced. Over time, the initial terror began to give way to a sober commitment to remembrance. I joined forces with Sasha and other local researchers to document the land's history, uncovering stories of both triumph and tragedy. Mia's gentle spirit, though still tinged with melancholy, found solace in community outreach, as she organized events to honor the indigenous communities and educate people about the true legacy of these woods. Even Eric, whose exuberance had once been overshadowed by fear, gradually began to channel his energy into conservation efforts, determined to protect the wilderness from further desecration. Yet, despite our efforts to turn that horrifying encounter into something meaningful, the memories of that night in the Adirondacks never truly faded. On cold, quiet nights, I still found myself lost in thought, my mind returning to the gaunt figure with its sorrowful eyes and the ancient burial mound that spoke of unhealed wounds. I realized that the creature's silent plea for justice and remembrance was a call that transcended fear. It was a call to action, urging us to confront the dark chapters of our past and to ensure that the voices of those long silenced were finally heard. In my quieter moments, I often sat by a window, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the city streets, and wondered if somewhere out there, in the quiet corners of the world, other guardians of the past were waiting to be acknowledged. The encounter in the Adirondacks taught me that horror is not always a matter of monsters and bloodshed. It can be a reflection of the deep-seated injustices that fester in the hidden recesses of our collective history. And while we may choose to flee from the immediate terror, we cannot escape the burden of memory or the responsibility to honor those who have suffered. Now, as I write these words, I feel the weight of that ancient sorrow pressing against my chest, a reminder that the land remembers and that its ghosts are never truly gone. The Adirondacks, with their timeless beauty and quiet agony, continue to whisper their secrets to those who are willing to listen. And I, forever changed by that encounter, have learned that sometimes the most profound horror lies not in what we see, but in the stories etched into the very soil, a tapestry of pain and resilience that binds us to a past we cannot ignore. Every time I hear the distant echo of children's laughter or catch a glimpse of a shadow moving where it shouldn't, I am reminded of that cold autumn night, of the creature whose eyes held a sorrow that spanned centuries. In those moments, I know that our brief encounter in the Adirondacks was not merely a brush with the supernatural. It was an awakening to a truth far greater than any one of us could have imagined. The wilderness, with all its beauty and terror, is a repository of memory, a silent guardian of histories that demand to be remembered. I continue to walk through life with that burden and privilege alike, the burden of knowing the depths of ancient grief and the privilege of having borne witness to a story that transcends time. And while I sometimes long for the simplicity of a life unburdened by such spectral reminders, I also recognize that our encounter in the woods has forever altered the lens through which I view the world. The line between the living and the forgotten is fragile, and in the quiet rustle of leaves or the gentle murmur of the wind, I can still hear the faint, timeless echo of a voice that once cried out for justice. In the end, we left the Adirondacks physically, but its spirit, with all its pain and mystery, remains entwined with our own. It is a lesson in humility, a call to respect the unseen and to honor the forgotten. And as I navigate a world that often prefers to bury its past rather than confront it, I find solace in the belief that even the darkest horrors can be transformed into a testament of remembrance, if only we have the courage to listen.